Hey, this is Pastor Bunjee Garrett, and I want to take this opportunity to present you with another word of encouragement. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm super excited about the signs of the times. And the reason why, well, it's because everything appears to be lining up for the rapture of the church, which will be followed by the time of tribulation, culminating in the return of our Redeemer, Jesus. This, of course, includes the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy regarding the rebirth of Israel, which occurred back in 1948. We're also watching Ezekiel's prophecy about the military confederacy between Russia, Turkey, and Iran that's currently being fulfilled right before our very eyes. Meanwhile, the dominance of America is being diminished as both of our political parties are working to collapse our economy. And all of this is happening while Brazil, Russia, India, and China are now working together in order to create a new alliance that will replace the hegemony of the West. Meanwhile, the UN is gearing up to engage in the biggest attempted power grab in the history of their organization. And to prove my point, let's consider an article that Justin Haskins wrote for The Federalist earlier this week. According to Haskins' article, the United Nations is preparing to host the Summit of the Future. This is going to take place in September of 2024. That's right. This landmark summit is less than 2 months before the next U.S. presidential election. And listen, this so-called Summit of the Future will result in UN member nations adopting a common agenda pact, which will solidify numerous policy reforms. And so you might be wondering, what are the policy reforms that they're planning to adopt? Well, according to Haskins' report, there are numerous radical proposals included in the agenda, and this includes a stunning proposal for a new emergency platform, which will give the UN significant powers in the event of future global shocks, such as another worldwide pandemic. Now, you might like to know that the details of the UN emergency platform were actually laid out just 3 months ago in a paper that was titled Strengthening the International Response to Complex Global Shocks, an Emergency Platform. Now, in this paper, we find the UN Secretary General writing this, and I quote, "I propose that the General Assembly provide the Secretary General and the United Nations system with a standing authority to convene and operationalize automatically an emergency platform in the event of a future complex global shock of sufficient scale, severity, and reach." In other words, the UN is gearing up to claim standing authority over all of their member nations so that, in the event of a complex global shock, the UN can step in and take control over both public and private sectors of every participating nation, including the US. In other words, in the case of a complex global shock, the UN will be able to take control of our nation's government, and not only that, but they'll also be able to set new policies for our public and private schools, not to mention our financial institutions and the entire private sector. Simply put, this so-called emergency platform will give the UN unprecedented authority over every country that adopts this plan. And what's even worse is that the Secretary General of the UN would have the ultimate authority to keep the emergency platform in place indefinitely and, all without any approval from the member nations. That's right. Once a global shock triggers this emergency platform, the UN will be able to seize sovereign control over every participating nation that's actually, dumb enough to sign on to this ridiculous plan. Now, in order to understand why I'm calling this a ridiculous plan, I want to take a moment to consider what they mean by global shock. Haskins explains it in this way, and I quote him, "What kind of global shock would trigger the emergency platform? The UN provides several possible examples in its formal proposal, including a major climatic event, future pandemic risks, a global digital connectivity disruption, major event in outer space, and my personal favorite, unforeseen risks." That's right. If Biden signs the U.S. Onto this UN emergency plan, well, then he's effectively allowing the UN to seize control of our nation in the event of unforeseen risks. I can't say it without laughing. It's just so ridiculous. Unforeseen risks. This emergency plan, trigger, it's so broad that literally any sort of unforeseen risk could result in the unconstitutional control of our country. And listen, the UN won't need approval to trigger the emergency platform. Here's how Haskins puts it, and I quote him again. The Secretary General would decide when to convene an emergency platform in response to a complex global shock. Or put in simpler terms, a global shock is whatever the UN's leadership says it is, triggered whenever the UN desires. Now, with all this being the case, there are those who believe that this emergency platform proposal is the biggest attempted power grab in the history of the United Nations. And yet, despite this fact, the Biden administration appears to be on board with this proposal. And of course they are, because they don't really believe in our Constitution. Here's how Haskins explains it in his article, and I quote, "Rather than assert America's independence and sovereignty, the White House has expressed its support for the emergency platform." U.S. Ambassador Chris Lu noted in at least two March 2022 speeches that the Biden administration backs the emergency platform along with numerous other proposals included in our common agenda. Yeah, that's right. The Biden administration is fully on board with this emergency platform, and seeing how the summit of the future is going to take place just 2 months before the next U.S. presidential election, well, I have no doubt that the president of the United States, Biden, he's preparing to place our nation under the control of the UN and without even batting an eye. And listen, all of this must take place so that the world can then be prepared for the rise of the Antichrist. Remember, it's in Revelation chapter 13. There we learn that the Antichrist will be given authority over the earth for 42 months. And it's going to be granted to him to make war with the tribulation age saints and even to overcome them. Therefore, when John tells us that he's going to be able to overcome the saints, well, that clues us into the fact that this is not the church age saints, because the gates of hell cannot prevail against the church. No, it's the tribulation age saints who will be overcome by the rise of the Antichrist. Not only that, but it's in Revelation chapter 13 where John tells us that the Antichrist will be given authority, and he's going to have authority over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So this is speaking of global domination. And not only that, but the Antichrist will also force every person to receive a mark in their right hand or in their forehead. And those who reject his mark, well, they're not going to be able to buy or sell. In other words, they're not going to be allowed to participate in the new global economy. They're not going to have access to the new global currency. Christian, listen, all of this is being put into place right before our very eyes. We're currently watching implanted microchips being normalized. Banks are gearing up for a central bank digital currency. Governments around the world are currently conditioning their citizens for mindless obedience to whatever emergency powers are put in place. And all of this in the name of safety and security. And at the same time, we're also watching Russia, Turkey, and Iran engaging in relations that are perfectly in line with Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And at the same time, the church is slipping into spiritual apostasy as more and more people embrace the cult of wokeism. With all this in mind, there should be no doubt that our redemption is drawing nearer and nearer every day. And with that being the case, it's time for the church to wake up from our spiritual slumber. It's time for us to stop pursuing the health and the wealth and the prosperity gospel and all this nonsense. It's time for us to get serious about our true calling, which is the great commission of Jesus Christ. Christian, listen, the Lord is calling us to go. He's calling us to go and make disciples of every tribe and tongue and nation. And with this as the calling, I encourage you to realize that we're standing on the mission field right now. Right now, you are on the mission field. Our mission field, Christian, is the place where we work. Our mission field is the grocery store where we shop. Everywhere we go, we are on the mission field. And seeing how the fields are already ripe for the harvest, then let's go. Let's go and let's lead people to Jesus so that they might be spared from the tribulation that's about to come upon this planet. Let's go and let's spread the good news about Jesus so that we can become those believers who are in fact fighting the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.